The dust swirled like angry ghosts across the main street of Bitter Creek, coating everything in a fine layer of red-brown grit. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the ramshackle buildings that lined both sides of the thoroughfare, their weathered boards groaning in the heat. Men lounged in the shade of the saloon's overhang, passing bottles of rot-gut whiskey and spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. The air hung thick with the scent of horse manure, gunpowder, and human sweat, the perfume of the frontier. Clara Matthews stood on the makeshift platform in the center of town, her hands bound loosely in front of her, eyes fixed on the packed earth beneath her feet. At 23, she should have been bouncing babies on her knee, but her womb had remained stubbornly empty through 5 years of marriage. In this harsh land where women were valued for their ability to birth the next generation of ranchers and farmers, she had become worse than useless. She had become a burden. "Step right up, gentlemen," her brother-in-law, Samuel, called out to the gathering crowd. His voice carried the false cheer of a snake oil salesman. "Got ourselves a fine woman here. Good cook. Keeps a clean house. Just got herself a little problem in the breeding department. But that don't mean she can't warm your bed or tend your home." Clara's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her chin up. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness in Bitter Creek was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. The men circling the platform eyed her like cattle at auction, some with pity, most with the calculating gaze of those looking for cheap labor. "She-Baron," a grizzled miner called out, scratching his matted beard. "Doc says so," Samuel replied without hesitation. "But she's strong. Can work sunup to sundown without complaint." "Might as well buy a mule, then." Someone in the crowd guffawed. "At least a mule's useful for more than cooking." Laughter rippled through the gathering, harsh and mocking. Clara's fingernails dug into her palms, but she remained silent. What defense could she offer? Her husband had cast her aside like a broken plow, and her own family had brought her here to be sold like livestock. In the eyes of these men, she was nothing more than damaged goods. "I'll give you $5. A portly man in a stained vest offered. "Need someone to wash laundry at my boarding house." $5, Samuel scoffed. "She's worth at least 20. For a barren woman, you're dreaming, Matthews." The haggling continued, each bid driving another nail into Clara's dignity. She watched a tumbleweed roll past, envying its freedom to drift wherever the wind carried it. At least tumbleweed served a purpose, spreading seeds across the prairie. What purpose did she serve? The crowd's chatter suddenly died, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Clara looked up to see the men parting like the Red Sea, creating a path for a lone figure approaching on horseback. The rider sat tall in his saddle, moving with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. As he drew closer, Clara could make out weathered features beneath a wide-brimmed hat, sharp cheekbones, a jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of cold ashes after a prairie fire. Jed Carson dismounted with economical movements, his spurs jangling softly as his boots hit the ground. At 35, he cut an imposing figure, broad shoulders, lean hips, and hands scarred by years of working cattle and surviving in this unforgiving land. He moved through the crowd without acknowledging the nervous glances thrown his way. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew Jed Carson by reputation, a man who kept to himself, who'd buried a wife and raised 4 children alone on a ranch that barely scraped by. He stopped at the edge of the platform, those ash-gray eyes taking in the scene with an expression that gave away nothing. His gaze swept over Samuel, the leering crowd, and finally settled on Clara. For a moment, something flickered in those eyes, not pity, but perhaps understanding. "How much?" His voice was low, rough from disuse, like leather left too long in the sun. Samuel's eyes lit up with greed. "Well now, Mr. Carson, didn't expect to see you here. $25 and she's yours." Jed reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. Without counting, he tossed it to Samuel, who caught it with eager hands. The weight of it made his eyes widen. "That's 50, Jed said simply. "Consider the extra payment for you to forget she ever existed." The crowd murmured in surprise. $50 was more than most of them saw in 3 months of hard labor. Samuel's fingers trembled as he opened the pouch, confirming the contents. "She's yours," he said quickly, as if afraid Jed might change his mind. "All yours, Mr. Carson." Jed stepped onto the platform, pulling a knife from his belt. Clara instinctively stepped back, but he merely cut the ropes binding her wrists. His hands were gentle despite their calluses, and when he spoke, his voice was meant for her ears alone. "You won't be judged anymore," he said. "Not in my house." He turned and walked back to his horse, clearly expecting her to follow. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, looking back at the crowd that had gathered to witness her humiliation. Not a single face showed regret or kindness. These people had known her all her life, had eaten at her table, had smiled at her in church. Now they watched her leave with the same indifference they'd show a stray dog. She followed Jed Carson. He helped her onto the wagon hitched behind his horse. His touch impersonal, but not unkind. As they rode out of Bitter Creek, Clara didn't look back. The town grew smaller behind them until it was nothing more than a dark smudge against the horizon. The journey stretched before them, miles of red dirt road winding through sagebrush and cacti. The landscape was harsh but possessed its own severe beauty. Mesas rising like ancient fortresses, their layers telling the story of ages past. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals, their cries the only sound besides the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of hooves. Clara studied the back of her unexpected savior. His shoulders were rigid, his posture alert even on this empty road. What kind of man paid $50 for a barren woman? What did he expect from her? The questions churned in her mind, but she dared not voice them. Not yet. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jed finally spoke without turning around. "Got 4 young ones at home," he said. "Lost their ma 2 winters back to fever. They need tending. House needs keeping. That's all I'm asking." Clara found her voice. "Why me? You could have hired any woman for less than what you paid." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his words were careful, measured. "Because you know what it's like to be deemed worthless by folks who should know better. My children don't need another person looking at them with pity or false charity. They need someone who understands that worth ain't always measured in the obvious ways." The words settled over Clara like a blanket, warming something inside her that had been cold for too long. She'd expected many things: servitude, humiliation, perhaps worse. She hadn't expected understanding. As darkness began to creep across the prairie, Jed pointed to a distant light. "That's home," he said, "such as it is." The ranch materialized out of the gloom, a modest cabin with a sagging porch, a barn that had seen better days, and a corral holding a handful of scrawny cattle. It wasn't much, but after the public shame of the auction platform, it looked like sanctuary. 4 small faces pressed against the window, watching their approach. Clara straightened her spine, smoothing her dusty dress as best she could. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than what she'd left behind. As Jed helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and sure, she made a silent vow. She might be barren, might be deemed worthless by the standards of Bitter Creek, but she would prove her worth here. Not to Jed Carson, not to his motherless children, but to herself. In this harsh land that broke the weak and buried the careless, she would find a way to bloom. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from distant mountains. Change was coming to this small ranch on the edge of nowhere. Clara Matthews was dead left behind on that auction platform. But whoever she was about to become, whatever name she would carry forward, that woman would not be defined by what her body couldn't do. She would be defined by what her heart could. The Carson Ranch sat nestled against a rocky hillside, where the wind sang mournful songs through the gaps in the barn walls. in the pale morning light. Clara could see the full extent of what would be her new home, a 2-room cabin with a lean-to kitchen, a vegetable garden long since surrendered to weeds, and a small herd of cattle that looked as weathered as the landscape itself. 4 pairs of eyes watched her from the porch as she climbed down from the wagon the night before, but the children had scattered like spooked rabbits when she'd tried to greet them. Now, standing in the kitchen at dawn, she faced her first challenge, making breakfast for 5 people in a kitchen that looked like it hadn't seen a woman's touch in years. The eldest, a boy of perhaps 12, appeared in the doorway. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and his clothes hung loose on his skinny frame. "Pa's already out with the cattle?" he said, his voice cautious. "Said you'd be making breakfast." "That's right," Clara replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "What's your name?" "Thomas." He shifted from foot to foot. "The others are Mary. She's 10. Then there's Samuel, we call him Sam. He's 7. And little Elizabeth, she's 4. Clara nodded, filing away the names. "Well, Thomas, perhaps you could show me where your PA keeps the supplies." The boy's expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure himself. Together, they excavated the kitchen, finding a sack of flour with suspicious holes mice. Clara noted with dismay some salt pork that had seen better days, and a jar of beans that rattled ominously when shaken. "This is what you've been eating," Clara tried to keep the horror from her voice. Thomas shrugged. "Pa does his best, sometimes misses. Henderson from the neighboring ranch sends over bread." Clara rolled up her sleeves. She'd worked with less in lean times. "Fetch me some water from the well, and let's see what we can do." What followed was a disaster of epic proportions. The beans, soaked overnight in water she'd forgotten to change, had developed a peculiar smell. She decided to mask it with what she thought was pepper but turned out to be gunpowder from a container stored too close to the spices. The resulting pot of beans not only tasted like ammunition, but actually sparked when she stirred it too vigorously. The bread was worse, unfamiliar with the temperamental stove. Clara managed to create loaves that were simultaneously burnt on the outside and raw in the middle. They could have been used as weapons or building materials, but certainly not as food. By the time Jed returned for the noon meal, smoke filled the kitchen. The beans had been hastily buried behind the cabin, and Clara stood covered in flour, her face flushed with embarrassment and exertion. The children, who had been watching the catastrophe unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination, fell silent as their father entered. Jed took in the scene, the smoke, the flour-covered woman, the plate of what might charitably be called bread, and Clara braced herself for anger or ridicule. Instead, he simply picked up one of the burnt loaves, broke off a piece, and chewed thoughtfully. "Better than my first attempt," he said after swallowing with visible effort. "I nearly poisoned the chickens." Little Elizabeth giggled, a sweet sound that broke the tension. "Pa made biscuits that bounced." "Like rocks," Sam added, warming to the topic. "We used them for target practice." Mary, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward shyly. "I can show you how Pa usually makes the beans," she offered, "if you want." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness. "I'd like that very much, Mary." The days that followed were a series of small failures and smaller victories. Clara learned that the stove had to be coaxed like a temperamental mule, that the well water had a mineral taste that required extra coffee to mask, and that each child had their own peculiar eating habits that their father had learned to navigate. Thomas, trying to be the man of the house, would eat anything without complaint but hoarded food in his room, a habit born from lean winters. Mary was particular about textures, separating everything on her plate so nothing touched. Sam would only eat vegetables if they were hidden in other things, and Elizabeth had to be told a story with every meal or she'd wander off halfway through. Clara adapted slowly, like a plant learning to grow in rocky soil. She learned to wake before dawn to get the stove heating properly. She discovered that Thomas would talk while helping with chores, sharing small pieces of his heart. Mary taught her which wild herbs grew nearby that could season their simple meals. Sam showed her his collection of interesting rocks, each with a story. And Elizabeth, sweet Elizabeth, began following her around like a little shadow, chattering about everything and nothing. But the children remained wary, testing her boundaries constantly. They'd had too many well-meaning women from town try to civilize them after their mother's death, each giving up when faced with the reality of ranch life and 4 grieving children. One evening, as Clara struggled to patch Sam's torn pants with her clumsy stitching, Thomas spoke up from his corner. "Mrs. Whitman said we were wild as coyotes, said we'd never amount to anything without proper raising." Clara looked up from her work. "And what did you say to that?" "Nothing." His voice was flat. "But Sam put a frog in her buggy." "2 frogs," Sam corrected proudly. Clara bit back a smile. "Well, I've seen coyotes, and they're quite clever creatures. Survivors. Nothing wrong with being wild if it keeps you strong." Mary studied her carefully. "Our last mother was strong too, until she wasn't." The words hung in the air, heavy with a child's grief and fear. Clara set aside the sewing and looked at each of them in turn. "I can't promise I'll never get sick," she said quietly. "Nobody can promise that, but I can promise that as long as I'm here, I'll do my best by you, even if my bread could shoe a horse and my beans taste like gunpowder." It was Elizabeth who broke first, climbing into Clara's lap with the trusting abandon of the very young. "Will you brush my hair? Pa pulls too hard." "Of course, sweetheart." As Clara worked the tangles from Elizabeth's hair, she caught Mary and Sam exchanging glances. Thomas pretended to read, but she could see him watching from the corner of his eye. Trust would come slowly with these children, built one small moment at a time. That night, after the children were in bed, Jed sat on the porch whittling while Clara attempted to salvage something from the day's cooking disasters. He'd said little since that first disastrous meal, but she'd noticed things, how he'd quietly fixed the loose board that had been tripping her, how he'd moved the good flour to where she could reach it, how he'd casually mentioned which foods each child favored. "They're starting to come around," he said eventually, not looking up from his whittling. Clara joined him on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "They're good children, just hurt. Their mother—" Jed paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah was everything I wasn't. Gentle, patient, knew how to make a house feel like home. When she died, I think we all forgot how to be a family. Just been surviving since then." "Surviving's not nothing," Clara said. "Sometimes it's everything." He looked at her then, those ash-gray eyes holding a warmth she hadn't seen before. "You'd know about that." It wasn't a question. Clara pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "My husband said I was like winter ground. Nothing would grow there no matter how much you tended it. My family agreed. Said I was taking up space a real wife could fill." "Fools!" The word came out harsh, angry. Jed's knife stilled on the wood. "They looked at one thing you couldn't do and missed everything you could." "And what can I do?" The question escaped before Clara could stop it, raw with years of doubt. Jed was quiet for a moment, then gestured toward the house. Elizabeth smiled today. Real smiled, not the pretend one she's been wearing like armor. Sam showed you his rocks. He hasn't shown those to anyone since Sarah died. Mary offered to help you, and she's been holding the whole house together by herself for too long. And Thomas is starting to remember he's allowed to be a child sometimes." He stood, pocketing his knife and the small figure he'd been carving a horse. Clara noticed. "That's what you can do. You can help us remember how to be a family again. If that's not worth something, I don't know what is." He went inside, leaving Clara alone with the vast prairie night. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound didn't seem mournful to her anymore. It sounded like a creature that knew exactly where it belonged. Tomorrow, she'd try the bread again. Mary had shown her a trick with the temperature, and Thomas had found a better container for the flour, safe from mice. Sam had offered to help gather eggs, and Elizabeth wanted to learn to make the biscuits her mother used to make. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this life would be easy. But as Clara sat on that weathered porch, listening to the night sounds of her new home, she realized something had shifted inside her. The wound of being barren was still there, might always be there, but it no longer defined her. These children didn't need her to give them life, they were already alive, wild and strong and resilient as prairie grass. They needed her to help them grow, to tend the family garden their mother had planted and their father had struggled to maintain alone. Inside, she heard Jed's low voice and Elizabeth's sleepy response. He was telling her a bedtime story, something about a brave rabbit and a clever crow. Clara smiled. Tomorrow, she'd ask Elizabeth to tell her the story, and maybe, just maybe, she'd finally get those beans right. The coyote called again, and this time, Clara heard it for what it was, not a cry of loneliness, but a declaration of presence. "I am here," it said. "I belong to this land, and it belongs to me." "I am here," Clara whispered to the stars. "And I belong." The storm rolled in from the mountains like an angry beast, turning the afternoon sky the color of old bruises. Clara had lived through prairie storms before, but this one felt different, meaner, hungrier. The cattle huddled together in the pasture, their lowing carried on the wind like a warning. "Get the children inside," Jed ordered, securing the barn doors against the rising wind. "This one's going to be rough." Clara didn't need to be told twice. She herded the children into the cabin just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the drops became a deluge, hammering the roof like bullets. The wind howled through every gap in the walls, making the oil lamps flicker and dance. "It's just a storm," Clara said, gathering the children near the stove. "We've weathered worse." But she could see the fear in their eyes, especially Elizabeth's. The little girl clung to her rag doll, her small body trembling. Storms had been hard on all of them since Sarah's death. She'd fallen ill during a storm, much like this one. "Let's tell stories," Clara suggested, trying to keep her voice light. "Thomas, why don't you start?" For 2 hours, they took turns weaving tales while the storm raged outside. The wind grew stronger, rattling the windows in their frames. Then, just as Sam was describing a battle between a brave rooster and a sneaky fox, lightning struck nearby with a deafening crack. Elizabeth screamed. "It's all right, sweetheart," Clara soothed. But when she touched the child's forehead, her blood ran cold. The little girl was burning with fever. "She gets them sometimes," Mary said quietly. "Ma used to know what to do." Clara's mind raced. She'd helped neighbor women with sick children before, but that was with proper supplies and help nearby. Here, in the middle of a storm, they were on their own. "Thomas, get me all the clean cloths you can find," she ordered, her voice steady despite her fear. "Mary, I need cool water from the water barrel. Sam, bring my sewing basket, there are herbs in the bottom." The children scattered to their tasks while Clara carried Elizabeth to the bed. The little girl's breathing was rapid, her skin flushed and hot. Clara had seen fever like this before. It could break in hours, or it could... No, she wouldn't think about that. Jed burst through the door, soaked to the skin. He took one look at Elizabeth, and his face went white. "Not again," he whispered. "She'll be fine," Clara said firmly, as much for herself as for him. "But I need you to keep the other children calm and the fire going. Can you do that?" He nodded, jaw tight. Clara could see the terror in his eyes, the memory of his wife's final days. But this wasn't the same. It couldn't be. The night became a blur of cold compresses, herbal teas, and whispered prayers. Clara lost count of how many times she changed the cloths on Elizabeth's forehead, how many spoonfuls of willow bark tea she coaxed between the child's lips. The storm raged on, matching the fever's intensity. "Mama," Elizabeth whimpered in her delirium. "Want Mama?" Clara's heart clenched. She wasn't this child's mother, could never be, but in this moment, she was what Elizabeth had. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking the child's damp hair. "I'm right here." She began to hum, then sing an old lullaby her own mother had sung, about a mockingbird and a looking-glass. Her voice was rough from exhaustion, but Elizabeth seemed to calm at the sound. Hours passed. The other children dozed fitfully by the fire, while Jed paced like a caged animal. Clara never left Elizabeth's side, monitoring every breath, every slight change in her color. "The fever should have broken by now," Jed said, his voice raw. "Sarah's took 3 days, by the end." "This is not that," Clara said sharply. "Elizabeth is strong. She's fighting." Sarah was strong too. Clara looked up at him, seeing not the tough rancher but a terrified father. "Then help her fight. She needs to hear your voice. Know you're here." Jed hesitated, then knelt beside the bed. His large, calloused hand engulfed Elizabeth's tiny one. "Hey there, little rabbit," he said softly. "You remember the story about the rabbit who was too clever for her own good? Well, she got into another scrape." As he spoke, weaving a familiar tale, Clara noticed Elizabeth's breathing seemed to ease slightly. She prepared another round of herbs, this time adding precious peppermint from her small store. The storm was beginning to weaken, but the real battle was here in this room. "Why don't you rest?" Jed suggested. "I can watch her." Clara shook her head. "We watch together." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding. A partnership forged in crisis. They settled into a rhythm, Clara tending to the physical needs, Jed providing the stories and comfort Elizabeth craved. Near dawn, with the storm reduced to a gentle rain, Clara felt Elizabeth's forehead and nearly cried with relief. The fever was breaking. The child's skin was damp but cooling, her breathing deeper and more regular. "Thank God," Jed breathed, his voice cracking. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, focused and clear. "Papa, Miss Clara." "We're here, sweetheart," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be just fine." "I'm hungry," Elizabeth announced, and Jed actually laughed, a rusty sound, but genuine. "Then Miss Clara will make you something special," he said. "How about those biscuits you like?" Elizabeth's face lit up. "The ones that don't bounce." Even Clara had to smile at that. "I think I can manage that." As she moved to the kitchen, she heard Elizabeth's small voice, "Papa, is Miss Clara my mama now?" The question hung in the air. Clara held her breath, not sure she wanted to hear the answer. "What do you think, little rabbit?" Jed asked carefully. "Mama went to heaven," Elizabeth said matter-of-factly, as children do. "But Miss Clara stayed. She sang to me." "Yes," Jed said quietly. "She stayed." Clara busied herself with breakfast preparations, giving them privacy, but her hands shook as she measured flour. Through the window, she could see the sunrise painting the rain-washed prairie in shades of gold and rose. The world looked new, cleansed. The other children woke to find Elizabeth sitting up, sipping weak tea and demanding stories. The relief on their faces was beautiful to see. They crowded around their sister, touching her as if to assure themselves she was real. "You scared us," Sam accused, but his voice wobbled. "Did not mean to," Elizabeth replied, then looked at Clara. "Miss Clara fixed me, like she fixed the bread." Mary laughed, the first real laugh Clara had heard from her. "Your fever must have been very high if you think her bread is fixed." "Hey now," Clara protested with mock indignation. "My bread has improved to merely weapon grade." Even Thomas cracked a smile at that. As the morning wore on and Elizabeth grew stronger, The family settled into a new rhythm. The crisis had shifted something fundamental. Clara was no longer an outsider trying to fit in. She was part of the fabric of their lives, woven in by a night of shared fear and desperate hope. When it came time for the noon meal, Mary naturally moved to help Clara in the kitchen. Sam set the table without being asked. Thomas helped his father with chores but kept popping back to check on Elizabeth. And Elizabeth herself, propped up with pillows, directed operations like a tiny general. "Miss Clara," she said during a quiet moment, "will you teach me the song about the mockingbird?" "Of course, sweetheart. So I can sing it to my dollies when they're sick." Clara smoothed the child's hair, still damp from the fever. "That's a wonderful idea." That evening, as the family gathered for supper, Jed cleared his throat. "There's something that needs saying." He looked at Clara directly. "Last night, what you did." "Any woman would have," Clara began, but he cut her off. "No, not any woman. Sarah's own sister visited last winter when Thomas took ill. She left after 2 days. Said it was too hard, too much." He paused, struggling with words. "You stayed. You fought for her like she was your own." "She is," Clara said simply, and realized she meant it. "They all are." Elizabeth piped up from her nest of blankets. "Mama?" Everyone froze. Clara's heart stopped. The child was looking at her, those blue eyes bright and trusting. "Hey," Clara looked helplessly at Jed. "If you want," Elizabeth continued in her matter-of-fact way, "you could be our mama. Our new one, since our first mama can't come back." Clara felt tears threaten again. She looked at each of the children. Thomas, trying so hard to be strong. Mary, who'd carried too much responsibility for too long. Sam, with his collection of treasures and wounded heart. And Elizabeth, sweet Elizabeth, who'd chosen to fight through the night and come back to them. "I would be honored," Clara said softly, "to be your mama, if you'll have me." Sam was the first to move, wrapping his arms around her waist. Mary followed, then Thomas. Awkward but sincere, Elizabeth held out her arms to be included in the embrace. When Clara looked up, she found Jed watching them with an expression she'd never seen before, something raw and vulnerable and infinitely tender. "Welcome to the family. Clara," he said roughly. "Officially." Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. In the Carson cabin, a family broken and mended, chosen and cherished, settled in for the night. Clara tucked Elizabeth in, singing softly about mockingbirds and looking glasses. The child's eyes grew heavy, but just before sleep took her, she murmured, "Mama." The word was a gift, a benediction, a new beginning. Clara kissed her forehead, then made rounds to the other children. Each accepted her good night with varying degrees of sleepy affection. This was her family now, not by blood or law, but by choice and love and 1,000 small acts of care. As she stepped onto the porch for a moment of quiet, she found Jed there, looking out at the vast darkness. "She called me Mama," Clara said wonderingly. "You earned it," he replied, "in all the ways that matter." They stood together in comfortable silence, two damaged souls who'd found a way to build something whole. The storm had tested them, but they'd weathered it. There would be more storms, this land guaranteed that, but they would face them together. In the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. This time, Clara heard it as a song of triumph. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned as they rolled into Bitter Creek, carrying Clara and the week's meager supplies. 6 months had passed since Jed had bought her freedom from that awful platform, and in that time, she'd almost forgotten the weight of the town's judgment. Almost. "Stay close," she murmured to Sam and Elizabeth, who'd begged to come along. Mary and Thomas had remained at the ranch with their father, tending to a sick calf. The general store smelled of pickle brine and tobacco. Familiar scents that now seemed foreign after months of prairie wind and sagebrush. Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, looked up from her ledger and froze. "Clara Matthews," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Or should I say, the Carson woman now." Clara kept her chin high as she approached the counter. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I need 2 pounds of salt, some flour, and whatever coffee you have." "Coffee's gotten expensive," Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes glittering with malice. "Though I suppose Mr. Carson pays you well enough for whatever it is you do out there." Elizabeth tugged on Clara's skirt. "Mama, why is the lady talking funny?" The word mama rippled through the store like a stone thrown in still water. Several women who'd been pretending to examine fabrics suddenly gave up all pretense of shopping. "The child calls you mother, Mrs." Abigail Pearson stepped forward, her face pinched with disapproval. She'd been Clara's neighbor once, had eaten at her table during harvest time. "How dare you playing mother to those poor motherless children when everyone knows you're barren as winter ground?" Sam's small hand found Clara's, squeezing tight. She could feel him trembling, not with fear, but with anger. At 7, he was old enough to understand cruelty. "A tree doesn't need to bear fruit to give shade," Clara replied evenly. "Now, about that salt, Mrs. Henderson. You always were prideful." Another woman chimed in, Mrs. Dorothy Mills, the banker's wife. "Too good to accept your lot, and now you've tricked some poor widower into taking you in." "Tricked?" Clara's composure cracked slightly. "I work from dawn to past dusk. I tend those children, keep that house, help with the cattle. Work a real wife could do while also giving him more children." "Mrs. Pearson interrupted. You're stealing food from the mouths of women who could give him what he really needs." Elizabeth pressed closer to Clara's side. "Mama's not stealing. She makes the best biscuits now. Only sometimes they're too hard." A few titters ran through the gathered women. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, the store door banged open. Jed stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, his presence filling the doorway. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance, Clara standing rigid at the counter, the children pressed against her sides, the circle of women with their cruel smiles. "Problem here." His voice was quiet, dangerous. "No problem at all. Mr. Carson," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "We were just discussing domestic matters." "Were you now?" Jed moved into the store with the controlled grace of a predator. "Seemed to me like you were discussing my family." "Your family, Mrs." Pearson drew herself up. "Mr. Carson, surely you understand the impropriety. This woman cannot give you children. She's deceiving those poor little ones into calling her mother when she can never—" "Stop!" The word cracked like a whip. Jed's eyes had gone cold as winter steel. "You want to talk about mothers? Let's talk about mothers." He moved to stand beside Clara, his presence solid and reassuring. "A mother is someone who sits up all night with a fevered child. Someone who knows that Thomas hides food because he's afraid of being hungry. Who figured out how to help him feel safe. A mother knows that Mary needs to be needed, that she's been carrying the weight of the house too long." His voice grew stronger, filling the small store. "A mother knows that Sam only eats vegetables hidden in other things, that he names every interesting rock he finds. A mother sings Elizabeth to sleep when nightmares come calling." "Pretty words," Mrs. Mills sniffed. "But they don't change facts. She's barren, useless to a man who needs sons to work his land." "Useless?" Jed laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This woman has taken 4 broken children and helped them remember how to smile. She's turned a house that felt like a tomb into a home. She works beside me, never complaining when the days are long and the profits scarce." He looked directly at Mrs. Pearson. "You say she's stealing food from other women's mouths. Tell me, where were these other women when my Sarah died? Where were you when my children were crying for their mother? When I was trying to figure out how to braid Elizabeth's hair or explain to Mary why her body was changing? The women shifted uncomfortably. Clara remembered those early days after Sarah's death. The few visitors who came brought casseroles and judgment, staying just long enough to feel virtuous before fleeing back to town. You came with your charity? Jed continued, his voice sharp enough to cut. Looked at my children like they were wild animals, tisked about the state of the house, and left feeling superior. Not one of you offered what they really needed someone to stay. We have our own families, Mrs. Henderson began. And Clara doesn't. Jed's hand found Clara's shoulder, warm and steady. Because she didn't birth them. Because her body won't do what yours will. Let me tell you something about worth, since you seem so concerned with it. He looked at each woman in turn. Worth isn't measured in the children you birth. It's measured in the children you raise, in the love you give, the home you make, the partner you are. Clara is worth more than all of you combined, because she sees value where you see only lack. Sam stepped forward, his young face fierce. She is our mama. She stayed when I was scared. She makes Papa smile again. She teaches me letters, Elizabeth added solemnly, and makes flowers grow. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, from the back of the store, came an unexpected voice. He's right. Everyone turned to see old Mrs. Buchanan, the town's eldest resident, leaning heavily on her cane. Been watching you hens peck at this girl for years. Shame on you. She hobbled forward, her ancient eyes sharp. I buried 3 babies before I had one that lived. Does that make me less of a mother? My sister Rose never had children of her own, but she raised 7 orphans during the cholera outbreak of '62. Was she not a mother? Mrs. Buchanan stopped in front of Clara. You keep your chin up, girl. The measure of a woman ain't in her womb, it's in her heart. And from what I see, yours is plenty big enough. She turned to Mrs. Henderson. Now, sell this family their goods and keep your opinions to yourself. Last I checked, this was a general store, not a courtroom. Mrs. Henderson flushed red but began gathering Clara's requested items. The other women dispersed, some shamefaced, others still muttering among themselves. As Jed loaded the supplies into the wagon, Clara found herself shaking not with humiliation, but with something else. Gratitude relief. She wasn't sure. Thank you, she said quietly as they headed out of town. For what? Jed kept his eyes on the road. Telling the truth. For seeing me as more than what I can't do. He was quiet for a moment. Sarah couldn't ride a horse to save her life, he said finally. Couldn't shoot straight, couldn't help with branding, but she made our house a home. She gave me 4 beautiful children, yes, but more than that, she gave me partnership, laughter, love. He glanced at her. You can't give me more children. Clara, but you've given my children back their mother. You've given me back my partner. That's worth more than anything those gossips could understand. Elizabeth had fallen asleep against Clara's side. Sam was dozing on the other. In the back of the wagon, the supplies that would keep them fed for another week rattled softly. Jed, Clara said softly. I know, he said simply. I know. The ranch appeared in the distance, Thomas and Mary visible on the porch. They waved enthusiastically, and Clara felt her heart swell. This was her family. Not perfect, not conventional, but hers. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara found Jed on the porch, whittling as always. Today in town, she began. Won't be the last time, he warned. People like their categories neat. We don't fit. No, Clara agreed, settling beside him. We don't. Bother you? She thought about it. It did, before, when I believed them. She watched the stars emerge one by one. But Elizabeth called me Mama in front of the whole town today. Sam held my hand. You She paused, searching for words. You stood up for me, for us. Always will, he said quietly. The certainty in his voice made her breath catch. This man, who spoke so little, had said more in her defense today than anyone ever had. He'd really seen her not as a barren woman, but as a mother, a partner, a person of worth. The children are lucky to have you, she said. And you, his knife stilled. They're lucky to have you too. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The sound carried across the prairie, wild and free and unashamed. Clara thought about the woman who'd stood on that auction platform 6 months ago, broken, worthless in her own eyes and everyone else's. That woman was gone. In her place sat Clara Carson, not by law perhaps, but by choice and circumstance, and the fierce love of 4 children who called her Mama. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be more trips to town, more whispers, more judgment. But tonight, she was home. Tonight, she was enough. Tonight, she was exactly where and who she was meant to be. The whiskey on Bill Hawkins's breath hit Clara before his hands did. She'd been checking the chicken coop near dusk when the neighboring rancher stumbled through the gate, his intentions written clearly across his flushed face. Well, the barren woman playing house. His words slurred together as he cornered her against the coop. Heard all about you in town. Man buys a woman. He's got certain expectations, but Carson's too soft to take what he paid for. You need to leave. Clara kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. Jed will be back from the pasture soon. Jed's checking the herd at the far ridge. Won't be back for hours. Hawkins moved closer, his bulk blocking her escape. Figured someone should show you what you're really here for. Clara's hand found the egg basket, gripping it like a shield. I'm warning you. Warning me. He laughed, an ugly sound. What's a dried-up woman gonna do? His hand reached for her, and Clara swung the basket with all her strength. Eggs exploded against his face, the shells cutting into his skin. Hawkins roared in rage and pain, lunging forward blindly. Clara tried to dodge, but his meaty fist caught her shoulder, spinning her into the side of the coop. Stars burst across her vision. She could hear the children in the house. They'd be coming to check on the commotion soon. She couldn't let them see this. You little... Hawkins wiped egg and blood from his eyes, advancing again. The shot split the evening air like thunder. Jed stood 20 feet away, rifle raised, his face carved from stone. Step away from her. Hawkins. Just having a conversation with your woman. Carson. Hawkins raised his hands but didn't retreat. No harm meant. Funny way of conversing, cornering a woman alone. Jed's voice was deadly quiet. Clara, come here. She moved on unsteady legs, skirting around Hawkins to reach Jed's side. His eyes never left the other man, but she felt his free hand touch her back briefly, checking for injury. You always were too soft, Hawkins sneered. Buying a barren woman, raising another man's whelps. Now you're pulling a gun on a neighbor over some misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Jed's rifle never wavered. I understand plenty. You're drunk. You're on my land. You put your hands on my woman. The only misunderstanding here is you thinking you'd walk away from this. You won't shoot me over some worthless? The rifle bullet kicked up dirt an inch from Hawkins's boot. The man jumped back, suddenly sober. That's your only warning, Jed said calmly. Get off my land. Come near my family again, and I won't miss. Hawkins backed toward his horse, his face ugly with rage and humiliation. This ain't over, Carson. A man's got a right to protect what's his. Jed cut him off. And everything on this ranch is under my protection. Remember that. They watched until Hawkins disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Jed lower the rifle, his hands shaking slightly. He turned to Clara, his eyes scanning her for injury. Your face. His jaw clenched at the bruise already forming on her cheek. I should have killed him. I'm all right. Clara touched the tender spot gingerly. More scared than hurt. Papa, Thomas appeared in the doorway, the other children crowding behind him. We heard a shot. Just scaring off a coyote, Jed said smoothly. You all get back inside. Supper's getting cold. The children retreated reluctantly. Jed waited until the door closed before speaking again. This is my fault. I should have known Hawkins would try something. The way he talked in town. You couldn't have known. I should have. His voice was rough with self-recrimination. Should have been here. Should have protected you better. Clara caught his hand, stilling its restless movement on the rifle stock. You did protect me. You came when I needed you. He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Clara, He stopped, struggling with words. When I saw him near you, I wanted to. I've never felt such rage. The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning. Clara's heart thundered in her chest. 6 months of careful distance, of polite partnership, of unspoken feelings, all of it trembled on the edge of something more. Come inside, she said softly. Let me tend that cut on your hand. He looked down, seeming surprised by the blood. Must have caught it on the fence running back. In the kitchen, with the children occupied by their supper, Clara cleaned the gash carefully. Jed sat still under her ministrations, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. You're shaking, he observed. Delayed fear, I suppose. She focused on wrapping the bandage, trying to ignore how aware she was of his nearness. I've never had anyone defend me like that before. Your husband would have blamed me for encouraging attention. The words came out bitter. Said my barrenness made me desperate for any man's notice. Jed's hand clenched. He was a fool. Perhaps. Clara tied off the bandage but didn't release his hand. Jed, what Hawkins said about you buying me, about expectations. Don't, his voice was firm. Don't let his filth touch what we have here. And what do we have? The question escaped before she could stop it. Jed turned his hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. A partnership, a family, a life being built together. He paused, then added quietly, and maybe something more, if you're willing. Clara's breath caught. Outside the window, the first stars were appearing. The children's voices drifted from the other room, Sam arguing with Mary about something. Elizabeth's giggles, Thomas trying to keep peace. This was her world now, her family, her home. She thought about the auction platform, about being sold like livestock. Then she thought about this man who'd paid for her freedom, not her servitude, who saw her worth when everyone else saw only lack, who'd just risked neighboring relations to defend her honor. I'm willing, she whispered. Something shifted in Jed's eyes, a wall coming down, a door opening. He stood slowly, his hand still holding hers, and drew her to her feet. With his free hand, he touched her bruised cheek with infinite gentleness. You sure? He asked. I'm not an easy man. Clara, I've got rough edges, 4 children, a ranch that barely breaks even, and a heart that sees me for who I am. Clara finished. That's worth more than all the rest. The space between them disappeared. His kiss was careful at first, mindful of her bruised face, but when she pressed closer, his arm came around her waist, pulling her against him with barely restrained need. The passion that sparked between them was unexpected in its intensity, months of careful distance igniting like dry kindling. Clara's hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring herself as the world spun. This was nothing like the dutiful kisses of her marriage. This was fire and promise and a hunger that matched her own. Mama, Elizabeth's voice from the doorway broke them apart. Is Papa kissing your hurt better? Jed laughed a real laugh, rich and warm. Something like that, little rabbit. Elizabeth nodded sagely. Good. Kisses fix everything. She scampered back to her siblings, clearly satisfied with this explanation. Clara touched her lips, still feeling the burn of his kiss. Jed Carson, What have you done to me?" He grinned, looking younger than she'd ever seen him. "Nothing compared to what you've done to me, Clara mine." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch in their usual spots, but everything had changed. The careful distance was gone, replaced by a new awareness. When Clara shivered in the cool air, Jed drew her against his side without hesitation. "Hawkins will make trouble," she said quietly. "Let him try." Jed's arm tightened around her. "I meant what I said. Everything on this ranch is under my protection, especially you." "I'm not afraid." And she realized it was true. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Together," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. In the distance, lightning flickered on the horizon, another storm building. But Clara felt no fear. She'd weathered worse storms than weather. She'd survived being deemed worthless, being sold, being judged. She'd found her place, her purpose, her family. And now, perhaps, she'd found something more. Not a love born of duty or desperation, but one forged in partnership and respect, in shared struggles and small victories. A love that saw her not as lacking, but as whole. "Take me rough," she whispered, the words escaping on a breath. Jed's body tensed against hers. His fingers played along her wrist, finding her pulse point. When he spoke, his voice was dark with promise. "Darlin, you think I'd go gentle?" The words sent heat spiraling through her. This man quiet, controlled, careful had depth she was only beginning to discover, and she wanted to explore every one. "The children," she began, "are asleep." He turned her to face him, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "But I'm a patient man, Clara. We've got time, all the time in the world." He kissed her again, slower this time, but no less intense, a claiming and a promise. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Clara felt as if her entire world had shifted on its axis. No more separate rooms. Jed said roughly, "No more pretending we're just partners in raising children. You're my woman, Clara, mine to protect, mine to cherish, mine to love, if you'll have me." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes to all of it." The storm on the horizon rumbled closer. But on the Carson Ranch porch, two souls who'd thought themselves too damaged for love discovered they'd been wrong. Love wasn't just for the young and whole and fertile. It was for the broken and mended, the tried and true, the ones who'd learned that worth came in many forms. And sometimes, the most valuable treasures were the ones others had thrown away. The scream tore through the afternoon quiet like a knife through cloth. Clara dropped the washing and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Thomas kneeling in the barn, Sam writhing on the ground beside him, blood pooling beneath the boy's leg. "The axe slipped," Thomas said, his face white with shock. "I told him to stay back, but—" "Never mind that now." Clara's hands were steady, even as her insides churned. The gash ran deep along Sam's thigh, blood pulsing with each heartbeat. "Thomas, run to the house. Bring my sewing basket and all the clean cloths you can find. Now!" Thomas sprinted away. Clara pressed her apron against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. Sam's eyes rolled back, his skin going pale as parchment. "Stay with me, sweetheart," Clara murmured, applying pressure despite Sam's weak cries. "You're going to be fine. Just stay with me." Mary appeared in the doorway, Elizabeth behind her. Both girls gasped at the sight of their brother's blood. "Mary, take Elizabeth inside," Clara ordered. "Heat water on the stove, lots of it." "Is Sam going to die?" Elizabeth's voice was small, terrified. "No," Clara said firmly, meeting the child's eyes. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Now go help Mary." Thomas returned with the supplies just as Jed burst through the barn doors. He took in the scene with one glance, his face going grim. "How bad?" "Bad enough." Clara didn't sugarcoat it. "The bleeding's slowing. but the cut's deep. He needs stitching. I'll ride for the doctor. No time, by the time you reach town and back. Clara shook her head. I'll have to do it. Jed knelt beside her. You've done this before. Helped my mother once, watched her a few other times. Clara's voice was steadier than her hands. It's not ideal, but do it. Jed's hand covered hers briefly. I trust you. Together they carried Sam into the house, laying him on the kitchen table. Clara sent the other children to the far room despite their protests. This was no sight for young eyes. Hold him still, Clara instructed Jed. This is going to hurt. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, Sam screaming weakly at the burn. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle, but when she bent to make the first stitch, they steadied. There was no room for fear, no time for doubt. This boy's life was in her hands. Stitch by careful stitch, she closed the gash. Sam had mercifully passed out from the pain, making her work easier. Jed held his son with gentle strength, his jaw tight as he watched Clara work. Almost done, she murmured, as much for herself as for them. Just a little more. When the last stitch was in place, Clara nearly collapsed with relief. She bandaged the wound carefully, then checked Sam's pulse. Steady, if weak. Now we wait, she said, wiping bloody hands on a ruined apron. And pray there's no infection. Jed carried Sam to his bed while Clara cleaned up. When she finally made it to the bedroom, she found all three other children gathered around their brother, watching him breathe. Is he going to be okay? Thomas asked, guilt heavy in his young voice. It's my fault. I should have been more careful with the axe. Accidents happen, Clara said gently, pulling him into a hug. What matters is you got help quickly. You did good, Thomas. You saved him, Mary said quietly, like you saved Elizabeth during the storm. Clara smoothed Sam's hair back from his fevered forehead. Not saved yet. The next few days will tell. Those days blurred together in a haze of vigilance. Clara barely left Sam's side, monitoring his temperature, changing bandages, coaxing broth between his lips. The wound stayed clean, but fever came anyway, burning through him like wildfire. On the third night, as Clara dozed in the chair beside his bed, Sam's voice woke her. Mama! Her eyes flew open. Sam was looking at her, his gaze clear for the first time in days. I'm here, sweetheart. Tears ran down her face as she felt his forehead. The fever had broken. I'm right here. It hurts, he whimpered. I know, but that means you're healing. She gave him a sip of water. You're going to be fine, Sam. Just fine. You fixed me, he said wonderingly, like you fix everything. Not everything. Clara laughed through her tears. I still can't make bread without burning it half the time. Sam's weak giggle was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. That's okay. We love you anyway. Jed appeared in the doorway, drawn by the voices. When he saw Sam awake and lucid, his shoulders sagged with relief. Hey there, son. You gave us quite a scare. Sorry, Pa. Sam's eyes were already drooping again. Mama fixed me, though she fixes all of us. As the boy drifted back to sleep, Jed drew Clara out into the hallway. Without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. You saved him, he said roughly into her hair. You saved my boy. Our boy, Clara corrected, her voice muffled against his chest. He's ours. Jed, they all are. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. How did we get so lucky? How did I find you? You didn't find me, Clara said softly. You saved me, and I saved you right back. That's what family does. The word family hung between them, weighted with meaning. Over the past days, the other children had been calling her Mama without hesitation. Even Thomas, trying so hard to be grown, had slipped and called her Ma when fear for his brother overwhelmed his reserve. The children need you, Jed said quietly. But it's more than that. I need you, Clara. Not just as a mother to them, but as— He struggled for words. As my partner, my wife, in all ways. Clara's heart skipped. They'd been sharing a bed since the night with Hawkins, but always with careful restraint, mindful of the children and proprieties. But now, is that a proposal? Jed Carson. It's a recognition, he said. You're already my wife in every way that matters. But if you want the words, the ceremony— He dropped to one knee right there in the hallway. Clara, will you marry me? Make it official in the eyes of God and the law. Yes, she breathed, pulling him back to his feet. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, until footsteps on the stairs broke them apart. Mama, Papa. Elizabeth stood there in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. Is Sam better? Much better, little rabbit, Jed said, scooping her up. And Mama and I have news. We're getting married. Proper married, with a ceremony and everything. Elizabeth's face lit up. Can I wear my Sunday dress? You can wear whatever you like, Clara promised, kissing her forehead. And will you still be our mama after? Elizabeth asked anxiously. I'll be your mama forever, Clara assured her. Nothing will change that. Good. Elizabeth snuggled against Jed's shoulder. Sam says you fixed him 'cause you're magic. Are you magic, Mama? Clara thought about the woman she'd been, broken and discarded, and the woman she'd become. About 4 children who called her mother and a man who saw her worth. About a family forged not from blood, but from choice and love and 1,000 daily acts of care. Not magic, she said finally. Just love. Love fixes a lot of things. Over the following days, Sam's recovery progressed steadily. The wound healed clean, though it would leave a significant scar. Clara tended him faithfully, and slowly the color returned to his cheeks, the sparkle to his eyes. When I grow up, Sam announced one afternoon, I'm going to marry someone just like Mama, someone who saves people. That's a fine goal, Jed said solemnly, though Clara caught the twinkle in his eye. Though you might want to wait a few years before you start looking. The children laughed, the sound of it filling the house like music. Even Thomas, serious Thomas, cracked a smile. They'd weathered another crisis, come through stronger. That evening, as Clara tucked Sam in, he caught her hand. Mama, I know you didn't born us, but you chose us. Right, even though we're not perfect. Clara's throat tightened. Oh, sweetheart, none of us are perfect, but yes, I chose you, all of you, and I'd choose you again every single day. Good, Sam said firmly, because we chose you too. You're our mama forever now. The paper just makes it official. As Clara blew out the lamp and headed to her own room, their room, she reflected on Sam's words. The paper would make it official. Yes, but what really mattered had already been decided in 1,000 moments like these. In choosing to stay, to fight, to love, she'd found her family, and they'd found her right back. Jed was waiting for her, standing by the window, looking out at the stars. The children are already planning the wedding, he said with amusement. Elizabeth wants flowers everywhere. Thomas is worried about having to wear his good shoes. And Mary wants to make your wedding dress. He turned to her. She said her mother taught her to sew before. She wants to do this for you. Clara's eyes filled. These children, how did they get so wonderful? They had a good mother, Jed said simply. 2 good mothers. Sarah gave them life. You gave them back their hope. He drew her into his arms, and Clara went willingly. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Ranch work never ended. Children always needed tending. But tonight, with Sam healing and wedding plans brewing and love filling every corner of their home, Clara Matthews, soon to be Clara Carson, knew she was exactly where she belonged. Thank you, she whispered against Jed's chest. For what? For seeing me, the real me, not the barren woman, Not the cast-off wife, but me." His arms tightened around her. "Thank you for seeing us. Not the broken family, not the widower with too many burdens, but us." Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, eternal and bright. Inside the Carson home, a family healed together, scars and all. The drought came like a thief in the night, stealing moisture from the earth until the prairie grass crackled underfoot and the creek dwindled to a muddy trickle. By midsummer, the Carson ranch looked as parched as Clara had once felt inside, dry, brittle, barely holding on. "The cattle are getting thin," Thomas reported at supper, pushing beans around his plate. At 14 now, he'd grown tall and lean, taking on more responsibility with each passing season. "Lost 2 more to the heat today." Jed's jaw tightened. They'd already sold half the herd just to buy feed for the rest. "We'll move the remainder to the north pasture tomorrow. Still some grass there." "For how long?" Mary asked quietly. At 12, she understood the stakes all too well. "Mrs. Henderson says their well is running dry." Clara ladled out the last of the stew, making sure the children got the heartiest portions. "Wells can be dug deeper. We'll manage." But managing grew harder each day. The vegetable garden Clara had coaxed from the stubborn soil withered despite her careful watering. The chickens stopped laying. Even the children grew listless in the unrelenting heat. Then came the men in black suits. Mr. Carson. The lead man tipped his hat, dust rising from the gesture. "Name's Cornelius Ashford. I represent the Mountain Pacific Railroad Company." Jed stepped onto the porch, Clara beside him. The children peered through the windows, sensing trouble. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ashford?" "It's more what we can do for you." Ashford produced a leather folder. "The railroad's coming through this valley. Your land sits right where we need to lay track. We're prepared to make you a generous offer." He named a sum that made Clara's breath catch. It was more money than they'd see in 10 years of good cattle prices, enough to start over anywhere, to give the children opportunities they'd never have otherwise. "Not interested," Jed said flatly. Ashford's smile never wavered. "Perhaps you should discuss it with your wife. Consider your children's futures. This drought won't last forever, but neither will our offer." After the men left, the silence in the house was thick as molasses. "It's a lot of money, Pa," Thomas said finally. "It's our home," Jed replied. "A home that's dying." Mary's voice was small but firm. "The cattle, the garden, everything." Clara looked around the room at the walls she'd scrubbed clean, the curtains Mary had helped her sew, the table marked with years of family meals. Then she looked at her husband's face, seeing the weight of decision there. That night, as they lay together in the dark, Jed spoke into the stillness. "Sarah's buried on this land. Her favorite rose bush, the one I planted for her, it's still trying to bloom despite the drought." "I know," Clara said softly. "But I see them. Clara, the children, getting thinner, working harder. What kind of father chooses sentiment over their welfare?" Clara turned to face him. "The kind who teaches them that some things matter more than money. That home isn't just a place, it's the people in it, the memories made there." Easy words when your children aren't hungry. "We're not there yet," Clara insisted. "And look at what we'd be giving up. Thomas learned to ride in that corral. Mary took her first steps in the kitchen. Sam's blood is literally in the barn floor. And Elizabeth, this is the only home she truly remembers." "You've made this place bloom," Jed said roughly. "Even in drought, you've found ways to create life here." Clara thought of the tiny garden behind the house, where she'd managed to keep a few hardy plants alive through sheer will. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. "Show me," she said suddenly. "Sarah's rose bush. I want to see it." They slipped out quietly, walking hand in hand under the star-filled sky. The bush stood near a small headstone, its leaves curled and brown, but with one defiant bud clinging to a thorny stem. "She loved yellow roses," Jed said quietly. Said they reminded her of sunshine on dark days. Clara knelt beside the struggling plant. The soil was hard as stone, but she began working it loose with her fingers. "Get me some water, just a little." "Clara, it's too far gone." "Please." He returned with a precious cupful. Clara poured it slowly around the roots, then pulled off the dead growth, leaving only the strongest stems. "My mother taught me that plants are like people," she said, working steadily. "Sometimes they look dead on the surface, but there's life deep in the roots. They just need someone to believe in them." A week later, Ashford returned with a higher offer and veiled threats about property values once the railroad went through. Jed sent him away again. The community divided. Some neighbors sold quickly, eager for the windfall. Others, like the Hendersons, held out. But as the drought deepened and the railroad's pressure increased, even the strongest began to waver. "You're fools," Bill Hawkins told them in town, his own pockets heavy with railroad money. "That land ain't worth dying for." "Nobody's dying," Clara said calmly, though she clutched her nearly empty shopping basket tighter. "We're living. There's a difference." That night, she found Elizabeth crying in her bed. "What's wrong, little rabbit?" "Annie Morrison says we're going to lose our home, that we'll have to live in the poor house like the Weatherby family did." Clara gathered her close. "Do you remember what I told you about my garden?" Elizabeth nodded against her shoulder. "Well, our family is like that garden. We might look a little wilted right now, but our roots go deep. We're stronger than any drought or railroad company. Promise." "I promise we'll always be together. That's what matters most." The next morning brought a miracle, or perhaps just the reward for faith. Thomas came running from the north pasture, shouting incoherently. "Water," he finally gasped out. "I found water." The whole family rushed to see, where Thomas had been digging a new fence post hole. Water seeped slowly from the ground. "Underground spring?" Jed said wonderingly. "Must have been here all along, just waiting." They spent the next days carefully excavating, revealing a steady flow of clean, cold water. It wasn't enough to save the whole ranch immediately, but it could keep the garden alive. The remaining cattle watered. The family sustained. Word spread quickly. Ashford appeared within the week, his offer now tinged with desperation. The railroad needed this route, and the Carsons' newfound water made their land even more valuable. "Name your price," he said bluntly. "Everyone has one." Clara looked at her family gathered on the porch. Thomas, growing strong and capable. Mary, wise beyond her years. Sam, recovered from his accident but bearing the scar proudly. Elizabeth, no longer the baby but still their ray of sunshine. Then she looked at Jed, her husband, her partner, the man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "You're right," she told Ashford. "Everyone has a price. Ours is this: the railroad can go around us or through someone else's land. This is our home. We've bled for it, cried for it, nearly died for it. We've found love here, built a family here. That's worth more than all your money." Ashford left in disgust, but the Carsons felt lighter than they had in months. That evening, as they sat down to a meal of vegetables from Clara's revived garden, Sam raised his glass of precious water. "To Mama," he said, "for showing us that barren ground can bloom if you just dig deep enough." "To our family," Clara corrected, tears in her eyes, "for teaching me the same thing." The drought would end eventually, as droughts always did. The railroad would find another route. But the Carson family had discovered something more valuable than rain or money. They'd found their unshakable strength in each other. Outside, a single yellow rosebud unfurled in the evening light. Proof that with faith, love, and stubbornness, even the most unlikely things could bloom. The land might be dry, but their roots ran deep, and sometimes that was all the water a family needed to survive. Weeks later, The first drops of rain began to fall. The children ran outside, dancing and laughing as the sky opened up. Clara and Jed stood on the porch, watching their family celebrate. "You know what you did?" Jed asked quietly. "Saved our home. More than that." He pulled her close. "You showed us that we're not just surviving anymore. We're living, thriving, even in the middle of the worst drought in memory. You found water, but more than that, you found hope." Clara leaned into his strength. "We found it together, all of us." The rain fell harder, soaking into the thirsty ground. Tomorrow there would be planting to do, repairs to make, life to rebuild. But tonight, the Carson family stood together, wealthy beyond measure in all the ways that truly mattered. In the garden, Clara's stubborn plants lifted their leaves to the rain, like the woman who tended them. They'd learned that sometimes the greatest strength came from the deepest struggles, and that with love, patience, and faith, even the most barren ground could bloom. The years had been kind to the Carson ranch. 20 summers had passed since Clara first arrived as a broken woman on Jed's wagon, and the land showed the patient work of loving hands. The vegetable garden had expanded into neat rows that fed not only their family but helped neighbors through lean times. The cattle herd, rebuilt after the great drought, grazed contentedly in pastures that stayed green through careful water management. Clara stood on the porch, her hair now more silver than brown, watching her grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas had married sweet Anna Morrison, the same girl whose parents had once sold to the railroad, and their 3 children filled the ranch with new laughter. Mary had become the town's schoolteacher, riding in each day to shape young minds. Sam ran the cattle operation now, his wife Rebecca gentle with the scar on his leg that still ached before storms. And Elizabeth, their baby, had just returned from San Francisco with her husband David, a doctor who'd fallen in love with her spirit and never once asked why she called Clara Mama. Grandma Clara, little Sarah, Thomas's eldest, ran up with a handful of wildflowers. "Look what I found. Can we put them on Great-Grandma Sarah's grave?" "Of course, sweetheart." Clara accepted the bouquet, remembering another little girl who'd once brought her flowers. "She would love that." The family gathered that evening for Sunday dinner, the table extended to its fullest length and still barely containing them all. The house rang with conversation, arguments, laughter, the sound of a family fully alive. "Remember when Mama couldn't cook a lick?" Sam teased, helping his pregnant wife to her chair. "Nearly poisoned us all with those beans. You survived," Clara retorted, ladling out her now famous stew. "Though I'm not sure how, considering you used to hide food in your room like a pack rat." "Did not," Sam protested, then grinned. "Okay, maybe a little." "A little," Mary laughed. "We found a petrified biscuit under your bed last year when we moved it." The stories flowed like water. Elizabeth's first day of school, Thomas learning to break horses, the time Mary put 3 frogs in misses, Whitman's buggy to defend Clara's honor. Each tale was worn smooth by retelling, but precious as gold. "Tell us about when Papa bought you," Sarah piped up, and the table fell quiet. Clara, Thor, and Jed exchanged glances across the length of the table. Even after all these years, that day remained a watershed moment in their lives. "Your Papa didn't buy me, sweetheart," Clara said gently. "He saved me. There's a difference." "But how?" the child persisted. Jed cleared his throat. "Sometimes people think a person's worth comes from just one thing, like how much money they have, or what they can do, or what they can't do. But real worth, that comes from here." He tapped his chest. "From the love you give and the family you build." "Your grandma taught us that," Thomas added, his voice thick with emotion. "She came to us when we thought we'd never be whole again, and she showed us that families aren't just made by blood. They're made by choice." "By staying?" Mary said softly. "When times get hard, when the storms come, when the world tells you to give up, you stay. You fight. You love. Elizabeth reached for Clara's hand. Mama gave birth to all of us, in every way that mattered, just not the way folks expected. Later, after the dishes were done and the younger children put to bed, Clara found herself alone with Jed in their garden. The yellow rose bush, Sarah's bush, bloomed proudly near newer plants, all thriving in soil that had once seemed barren. "Regrets?" Jed asked, pulling her close. Clara considered the question, as she did every year on this anniversary. 20 years since she'd stood on that platform, deemed worthless. 20 years of marriage, of motherhood, of building something extraordinary from broken pieces. How could I regret the path that led me here? She gestured to the house, glowing with lamplight and filled with family. I wouldn't change a single step, not even the pain, especially not the pain. Clara turned to face him, her eyes bright. The pain taught me I was stronger than I knew. It prepared me to fight for this family, to understand that worth isn't measured in what your body can or can't do, but in how much love your heart can hold. Jed kissed her forehead, and they stood together watching the stars appear. Inside, they could hear their son-in-law David reading to the children, Rebecca and Anna talking quietly about baby names, Thomas and Sam arguing good-naturedly about cattle prices. You know what Sarah told me once? Jed said suddenly, right near the end, when she knew she was leaving us. Clara waited, knowing this was important. She said, find someone who'll love them like they're her own. Someone who understands that motherhood isn't about giving birth, it's about giving life. I thought she was feverish, talking nonsense, but she knew. Somehow, she knew you were coming. Tears ran down Clara's face. All these years, she'd worried somewhere deep inside that she was betraying Sarah's memory, taking her place. But maybe she hadn't taken anything. Maybe she'd simply accepted what was freely given a family that needed her as much as she needed them. A small hand tugged at her skirt, her youngest grandchild. Samuel, named for his father, stood there in his nightshirt. Grandma, will you tell me a story? Of course, my love. What kind of story? About the lady who couldn't have babies but became everyone's mama anyway. Clara smiled, lifting him into her arms. Well now, that's my favorite story. It starts with a woman who thought she was worthless, standing in the middle of a dusty town. As she carried him inside, Clara caught sight of their reflection in the window, an older woman with silver hair and laugh lines, holding a child who wasn't hers by blood but hers by every choice she'd made. Behind them, the garden bloomed in defiance of the nature's rules, proof that love could make anything grow. In the morning, there would be breakfast to make for a house full of family. Mary would need help preparing for the new school term. Rebecca would want to discuss baby preparations. The ranch would demand attention. The garden would need tending. Life would continue in its beautiful, messy, complicated way. But tonight, Clara Carson wants Matthews. Once nobody was exactly where she belonged. She'd given birth not to children, but to a legacy of love that would outlive them all. The barren woman had become the roots of a family tree that would shade generations. She gave birth not to my blood, but to my life. Jed had once said, now, looking at her gathered family. Clara understood the full truth of those words. She'd birthed their lives, their hopes, their futures, not through her womb, but through her unwavering love. And that, she knew, as she settled into Jed's chair with her grandchild, was the greatest fertility of all. The oil lamp flickered as young Samuel fell asleep to her story, and Clara smiled. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and blessings, but tonight, in this house built on love rather than blood, filled with children who called her mama and grandchildren who called her grandma, Clara Matthews Carson was complete. The barren ground had bloomed beyond her wildest dreams. Outside, coyotes sang to the moon, not mournful now, but celebrating. And in the garden, every flower lifted its face to the stars, grateful for the woman who'd believed they could grow even when everyone said the ground was too hard, too dry, too worthless. Love, Clara had learned, was the water that could make anything bloom, and she had loved so well, so fiercely, so completely, that life had sprung up everywhere she touched. This was her harvest, a family grown not from her body, but from her heart. And it was more abundant than any field of wheat, more precious than any gold the railroad could offer, more lasting than any monument. She'd been bought for $50 by a desperate widower. She'd earned something priceless, the title of mother, written not on any birth certificate, but on the hearts of all who called her name. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts about Clara's journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Wild West Night. Hit that like button, and don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover this tale of love, family, and redemption in the Old West. Your support means the world to me.